what we were going to be going through, and this is a whirlwind tour of all the topics that we could be discussing, but we'll be talking about the role of the presiding officer and the secretary, your basic rights of members, actions that may not be taken without a quorum, the standard order of business, how an agenda is adopted, how a meeting adjourns or takes a recess, how to obtain recognition, the 6 steps for processing a motion, the rules of decorum for debate, including germaneness, the length and number of speeches permitted in debate, standard vote requirements to adopt a motion, and how actions may be taken by unanimous consent. And as I'm sure you've been told, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, and I'll either answer them as we go through the meeting, or there will be some time at the very end to answer any final questions you might have. So bylaws are how power is allocated in organizations. When organizations are first formed, all the power belongs to the people, and the bylaws are how power is allocated from the people to the officers and to the boards and to committees. And the basic rule is power should only be given for efficiency. Too often leadership drafts bylaws that take more power than necessary. And so that's when you start getting a lot of divisive activity inside of organizations, because power has been taken away from the membership. There's a hierarchy of rules that come into play. So the predominant rules are the federal and state laws. And then if your organization has a corporate charter, that's the next level for your organization. And then below that, you can have either a constitution or bylaws. And then below that are the rules of order. And those are usually an adopted standard set of rules, such as Robert's Rules of Order. And what those do is take up all of the things that govern the meeting that you do not want to customize for your organization. So really, you put customizations inside the bylaws, and then anything that's not in the bylaws defaults to what is in Robert's Rules of Order. And that saves you from having cumbersome bylaws that are very difficult to administer. Below that are special rules of order, and those are rules where for one reason or another, people have agreed to give up some portion of their basic rights inside of meetings, such as the duration in which people can speak. Below that are standing rules, which are more procedural in nature and really good for just making very clear how things like elections are going to run, or anything else that needs to be specified in your organization. And then below that are customs, which are things that you do that you haven't documented, but your organization typically does. And these are things like, like maybe saying the flag salute at the beginning, or presentation of the colors, or maybe a program. In a democratically run organization, you have, first of all, there's a definition of what a member is in your organization, and that should be defined in the bylaws. And then if you are a member of the organization, you should have 4 basic rights. You have the right to attend meetings, you have the right to make motions, you have the right to speak in debate, and you have the right to vote. And no member can be individually deprived of your basic rights except through disciplinary proceedings. So, one of the things that we've experienced since 2020 is electronic meetings. Organizations that had already passed rules to allow for electronic meetings were okay going into the whole pandemic thing, but organizations who had not agreed to it were on pretty thin ice, because the ideal democratic meeting is everyone in one room where you can see and hear and speak to each other, and any deviation from that usually involves giving up some level of rights so that you can have an electronic meeting. And so if you have an electronic meeting, you should also have a set of rules that the body has agreed to by which the electronic meetings will be conducted. There are organizations that have taken advantage of the pandemic and just put everybody on mute, which means that people cannot make things like interrupting motions because they can't interrupt. And in worst cases, you've got chairs of organizations not acknowledging people they don't like because they don't want them to, they think they're an irritant or whatever. It's really important to have rules that everyone has agreed to on how the electronic meetings will be run, so that everyone knows what the basic rules are and no one's rights are taken away inappropriately. I have a set of standing rules that I use and often share with groups who want to see what we do. There's also in Robert's Rules of Order, 12th edition, a very expansive section on electronic meeting rules for different types of circumstances, which you might want to get into. They're very elaborate rules and sometimes a little bit difficult to parse, but that's sort of the gold standard for electronic meeting rules. That was the big change between the 11th edition and the 12th edition, in that in the past decade, we've had this emergence of the internet and online meetings. And I got some examples of rules that I typically recommend. Attendees should be self-muted but able to speak at any time, which will allow for the interrupting motions. The polling tool in Zoom works really well for taking votes. It takes a little bit of extra work to figure out how to make it function, but it's much better than having people raise their hands, because everyone, there's multiple devices that people can log into meetings, and each of them has sort of their own device's interpretation of how to raise your hand. And what you really don't want to do is deprive people of their right to vote. And I always recommend that chat be disabled, because if you were sitting in a room and having a meeting, the chair shouldn't be allowing discussion on the floor, which is really what the chat room ends up being. If someone has something to say, they need to raise their hand and be recognized and speak. And so people are not dividing their attention between what is being said in the meeting and what is being written in the chat room. The role of the presiding officer, and these are your basic duties as defined in Robert's Rules of Order. These can be augmented by other responsibilities in the bylaws, but in the absence of giving them any additional power, their role is to open meetings, to propose the agenda, to recognize members who are entitled to the floor, state and put to a vote all questions that legitimately come before the assembly, to enforce the rules of debate, to respond to inquiries, and to adjourn the meeting. And then, as I said, anything else should be defined in the bylaws. The presiding officer must be impartial, and they should avoid engaging in debate, and they cannot vote except in circumstances where there's a secret ballot, or to break a tie. And that's to preserve the impartiality of the chair. They also cannot abuse their knowledge of parliamentary procedure over those who are not as informed, and they cannot be unfair. They must treat all members equally. One of the things that I do when I'm presiding over a meeting is I over-explain the effect of different motions, so that people have a complete understanding of what's going on. And you should never have people sitting in the meeting scratching their head wondering what they're voting on, or what the process is that they're being led through. The role of a secretary is to be the recording officer of the assembly, and to be the keeper of all the records, and to keep a record of the proceedings of the organization, which is usually called the minutes. Their duties are listed in the Parliamentary Authority, and if there's anything else that the secretary does, they would be listed in the bylaws. There's really only two roles that are required for democratic meetings, and that one is the presiding officer, which is the person that would lead the meeting, and then the secretary, which is to record the actions. And any of the other officers are created at the convenience of the organization. Agendas are the order of business that the meeting will be run. Sometimes agendas are published in advance, but such an agenda is provided for information only. So you can't look at an advanced copy of it and then sort of hold the presiding officer to that. It's really when you get into the meeting, the presiding officer presents the agenda to the assembly for either for adoption, and it's at that point that the agenda is subject to amendment, and it can be amended by majority vote. And then after an agenda has been adopted, no change can be made to it except by a 2/3 vote, a majority of the entire membership, or unanimous consent. Usually most organizations are very harmonious, and so things are done by unanimous consent. But what that means is if you don't agree with something, don't be shy about objecting, because if one person objects to unanimous consent, then that forces the chair to go back to taking a vote to make sure that the will of the majority is being carried out. One of the questions I had was, what about, I'll talk about time limits when I go through this. So what this slide shows are the standard order of business for meetings in the absence of a different order of business that's placed inside the bylaws. So after the adoption of the agenda, you should have the reading and approval of the minutes. Then you would have the reports of the officers, the boards, and the standing committees. Then you would have the reports of special committees. And then you would have special orders. And these are activities which are mandated in the bylaws, such as, elections will happen in January of odd numbered years. So that would be a special order. Those are followed by unfinished business and general orders. Unfinished business would be business from the previous meeting that didn't get addressed and is being carried over. And general orders are, just general business that's brought before the assembly. And then the final item on the agenda should be new business, which gives all members the opportunity to make motions from the floor. So as the bottom of the slide says, in organizations that have adopted Robert's Rules of Order as their parliamentary authority, this is the standard order of business. There are other authorities which your organization may adopt that might have something different. But Robert's Rules of Order is used by 95% of the organizations in the United States. So it's sort of the gold standard. One other thing about agendas is that you can put times on the agenda when the agenda is adopted, and then those become immutable, except when there's a decision by the body to change them. So if you say that special orders will begin at 8 o'clock, if there is something going on the floor, you can either they can either wrap it up, or you can lay it on the table, or you can postpone it to a subsequent meeting. But if it says special orders are happening at 8 o'clock, then the chair needs to wrap up the current business and then move to that. If someone wants to change this to be 8:30 because they want to finish the current business, they can move to add 30 minutes to that item to move it out so you can finish it. And what this really does is puts the control of the meeting on the majority of the members. Another place where you could put a time is on the adjournment. So you could say that the meeting adjourns at 9 o'clock. And if that's agreed to when the meeting starts, that's a real benefit, because then people know that it's not going to be a meeting that's going to go until midnight unless the majority agrees to do so. And then if you get to 9 o'clock and people want to, by a 2/3 vote, people want to extend the meeting because they're just so excited about the topics that are being discussed, then that's their right to do so. But having at least an adjournment time is a nice way of making sure that meetings are not interminable. I'm not the most people-centric person, and so I always forget to add recesses to meetings, but it's always a good idea if you have a meeting that's over an hour long to set in sort of the middle of the meeting a recess so people can stand up and stretch their legs and go have a cigarette or whatever they want to do, and then come back to the room. Meetings that plow on for hour after hour are really, really painful, and it's hard to keep people's attention to it. And so it's always a good idea to have a recess in the meeting for like 5 minutes or 10 minutes. If there is no recess provided for, a member can always move, and this is an this is a privilege motion. A member can move that you have a recess for like 10 minutes, and then if the majority agrees to it, then you can recess for 10 minutes. So the key thing is it's really the will of the majority that gets to prevail. Obtaining recognition from the floor. So, meetings cannot be free-for-alls, and it's important that before a member and an assembly can make a motion or engage in debate, they have to obtain the floor. And so, if you're having an in-person meeting, you either do that by standing or raise your hand or whatever the custom is to be recognized by the chair. And the chair must recognize any member who seeks the floor and is entitled to it. Now, might be people in the meeting who are not members, so they're observers. And this is a situation you sometimes see in public meetings where you have like a county commission meeting. All the public in attendance are not members. The members of a Board of Commissioners meetings are the commissioners. And so there are specified times where the public can speak, but otherwise they're not allowed to speak. But the chair must recognize any member who seeks to be entitled to speak to the floor. And if they don't have if it's a really, really big hall, you can say, Mr. Chair, to get their attention. There are motions called interrupting motions, which can be made without being recognized. And so if you are really interested in the interrupting motions, then this would be a good use of your copy of Robert's Rules of Order. They go through all the motions and the required vote for passing the motions and whether or not it can be interruptible and whether it needs a second and all that kind of stuff. There's a number of motions that do not require a second. So calling for a division of the assembly, which means you've taken a voice vote and it's not clear who the prevailing side was, and you want a division. And so if someone calls for a division, then you would do a rising vote so people could stand up, and whatever it takes to prove that which side prevailed on the decision. Calling for the orders of the day is an example of an interrupting motion, and what this means is you're going through the agenda, and for some reason the discussion has gotten sidetracked on something else, and the chair has become so engaged in the discussion they've lost track of the meeting. Any member can call for the orders of the day, which means I want the agenda adhered to. This is an interrupting motion and does not require a second. And what this means is, every member has the power to keep the meeting on track. You don't have to sit there and endure discussion about something that is not germane to the discussion if you choose not to do so. A parliamentary inquiry also does not require a second. And this is where if someone does not know how to do something, they can make a parliamentary inquiry, and the chair then would explain the process for doing it. So, an example would be, how do we reconsider the vote on the motion that was taken at the last meeting? And so the chair would explain to the membership the process for doing that. A point of order is interruptible, and that's when you feel that something is being done inappropriately. So it's being done either against the rules of order, or it's being done against the bylaws, or even a state or federal law. And this also doesn't require a second, because you're making a point of order, and this is how you start the process of questioning whether something is being done legitimately or not. And then the third of this set is the request for information. And so this is more broad, like, Madam Chair, the treasurer was absent at the last meeting, and so perhaps we could have more detail on the transactions of the last meeting, or whatever they want to know. And those are requests for information. All the questions are always directed through the chair, and the chair is sort of the traffic cop for getting the answers back to the person who made the request. And then the final one is object to the consideration of a question, which has its own characteristics, and that's about not considering something that's inappropriate.
Larry?
Yeah.
We did have a question. A participant wants to know if we covered calling a member to order.
It might be covered later in the presentation, and so if we don't, I'd be glad to go over that. I've unfortunately had to deal with that.
No worries.
Motions are how business is brought before the assembly, and so it's really important for everyone to understand how a motion is made. Motions can come from committees, and they can come from members on the floor. And this is how you would bring up business before the assembly under new business. And so the proper way in which that a motion is handled is that a member raises their hand and they make a motion, and they say, I move that, blah, blah, blah. You don't use the form that everyone seems to use, which is I make a motion. It's I move that we do so and so. And for motions, for general motions, there has to be a second. So there has to be two people who want to do this thing. And then after it's been seconded, the chair states the question of the motion, and that's the chair stating the motion as it was phrased by the member. The chair should not paraphrase it because it's the words of the motion that everyone will be debating and voting on. And it's what should be recorded in the minutes of the meeting, the exact wording of the motion that is being made. And I always recommend to people, if they're going to be making motions, if at all possible, think through them in advance of the meeting and write them out, because whatever gets passed is what will be done, and you don't want to do something with unintended consequences. After the chair states the question of the motion, like the question before you is, shall the organization buy a pickup truck? Then members raise their hand and they debate the motion. And then after the debate is finished, the chair puts the question, which is, so the question before you is, shall the organization buy a truck? And then the chair takes a vote. All those in favor of the organization buying a truck, please say aye. All those opposed, please say no. And then the chair says the ayes have it or the noes have it, and then they state the result of the vote, and it would be, so the ayes have it and the organization will buy a truck. There are rules of decorum for debate. So if you are debating the purchase of a truck, you cannot go off and start debating the holiday party from the last season. So you have to confine your remarks to the merits of the question before the assembly. There's rules of decorum. So all members should refrain from attacking another member's motives. The whole idea of, if you remember where democracy came from. It came from the Enlightenment. And so it's all about debating ideas, not personalities. So no matter how odious the person who made the motion is, you're really debating the ideas that have been brought before the committee. And then they also recommend that you avoid using members' names, although this is something that's not that critical. What you don't want to do is personalize the interactions so that people feel like they're being attacked. And so that's why Robert's rules avoids using members' names. I talked in the beginning about the special rules. So the two of the rules that are commonly found in organizations are on the length and number of speeches. The default duration inside Robert's Rules of Order for speeches is 10 minutes. And so if you imagine, 3 people taking their full 10 minutes, that's a half an hour, which, could easily be a third of the whole meeting, and you're still just debating it. So what you often find is organizations passing special rules of order that limit the duration of the debate to something more reasonable, like 3 minutes or 5 minutes, and then the frequency that which someone can speak on a particular topic. So the default on a motion or an amendment is twice. And so what you might do is to compromise on shortening the duration is giving people more opportunities to speak. But I think this is one of the things that chairs often forget, is that people only have the right to speak twice on a motion. And this is when people start going back and forth, and you start getting argumentative behaviors. Really, they can only speak twice on a motion, and that should keep the meetings down to a tolerable duration. Special rules require a 2/3 vote, but they're also a separate set of rules, and they can also be suspended by a 2/3 vote. So, if you have something really important and you want people to have debate more frequently or more often than 3 times, or whatever your special rule is, someone can say, I move to suspend the special rules of order and allow people to speak 5 times on topics. And if that passes by a 2/3 vote, then that becomes the rule for the meeting. So the basic rule in a democracy is that things are passed by a majority vote, and the word majority means more than half. And the principles have been established that a 2/3 vote are required to adopt motions that suspends or modifies the rules previously adopted, prevents the introduction of a question for consideration, to close, limit, or extend debate, to close nominations or the polls, or otherwise curtail the freedom of nominating or voting, or takes away anything from the membership. So those are instances where it requires a 2/3 vote to do those sorts of things. Unanimous consent is a great way to make meetings a little bit more efficient and get through the more routine stuff. In most organizations, you're lucky if people read the minutes. And so going through a whole procedure for taking a vote on the minutes is sometimes redundant. And if you have a great recording secretary and always does ironclad minutes, then what the chair can do is say, are there any changes to the minutes? Hearing no changes, if there is no objection, we will adopt the minutes by unanimous consent. Hearing no objections, the minutes are adopted. And you can see that within 20 seconds, you've dispensed with the minutes and you're moving on to the key parts of the more important parts of the meeting. If you see something in the minutes that is incorrect, then you need to move to amend the minutes and deal with it, because the minutes end up being the record of the business, and it's very important that the minutes accurately reflect the decisions of the body, because in 3 months you're going to forget exactly what was passed, at an earlier meeting. And so the minutes are where you go back and correct it. The one other thing about minutes, and I don't know if I've talked about this later, but minutes can always be amended. So even though you've approved the minutes in a meeting from your previous meeting, if you find, 6 months later that minutes were approved and they were incorrect, you can always move to amend the minutes and get them corrected. There is no time limit on when minutes can be amended. The thing that you don't want to do is to have the minutes amended so they don't represent the truth. The way unanimous consent is done is the chair can say things. If there is no objection, the chair should always pause, giving people an opportunity to object. And then if there is no objection, the chair says, if there's no objection, then the action is decided upon. The two places where you commonly use this is, the vote on the agenda and the voting on the prior meeting minutes. You can also use this in motions. So if, sometimes you get people who want to bit twiddle motions and they want to change one word to another word because they feel the second word is better. Instead of taking a vote on a secondary amendment or and going through all that, the chair can just say, if there is no objection, we will change the word from whatever it is to whatever it will be. And of course, if you object, you should object. But if you don't object, then the chair can say, hearing no objection, the motion, the amendment is accepted and the word is changed to such and such. And that also helps speed along. One of the areas of Robert's Rules of Order that make people hate Robert's Rules of Order is when you get mired in this formal business of amending something so that it's perfect. These were questions that were given to me previously, and I can go through these quickly. I think we have time, and then we'll take the questions from the floor. So someone asked, when do you call the question? And calling the question is one of the most abused parts of Robert's Rules of Order that I've come across. The improper way to do this is for someone to yell out question and the chair to say the question has been called, we'll move to a vote. What this is ending debate and moving to a vote, and you can't do that without the permission of the assembly. So the proper way to call a question, and first of all, you don't do this until hopefully there's been at least some debate, so people have the ability to discuss what's going on. But if debate is getting redundant and no one is adding additional information, any member can raise their hand and say, I move to call the question, which is being moved to the vote. Then the chair would say, is there a second? So there has to be a second to calling the question. The chair would then say, and it's not debatable, so the chair would say, the question has been called. All those in favor of ending debate, please say aye. All those opposed, please say no. And if by a 2/3 vote, the body has decided to end debate and go to a vote, then that's what you can do. But you certainly don't do this just because someone shouts out question, and you don't end debate without a second, and the person shouldn't be shouting out unless they've been recognized anyway. At what portion of the meeting should people be permitted to make comments? Meetings run democratically. The point in which you engage is either during debate or in making incidental motions during the meeting. There is no point for people to comment other than during those circumstances. You can always ask questions. That's appropriate. So if you have a committee member giving a presentation on the expansion of the building, that's certainly where people can ask questions. If something is then moved so that you make a, so the committee moves that we expand the building with a construction budget of $2 million. Certainly that's when you have the right to debate and comment on the motion itself. How thorough do the minutes need to be? The minutes record what was done, not what was said. So unless you have a rule or a law that requires you to take down every word that that people say, more like a transcript, you just record the motions that are made, and then whether they passed or failed. And of course, if there's any amendments, those would be recorded as well. How do you redirect a meeting that's gone off topic? Well, I said that either the chair should monitor it and call people to order if they have not, if they've gone on topic, or any member has the right to do so. If someone was not present at the previous meeting, and do they need to abstain when the minutes for that meeting are approved? No, they do not. If you were at a meeting and you missed the prior meeting, you have the right to vote. And unless you have a rule that says that if you were not at the prior meeting, you can't vote, you have the right to vote. I believe there were a couple of questions that also came in. So now would be a good time to answer those.
So just want to make sure did we cover calling a member to order?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, calling a member to order. So if you find someone not behaving appropriately, and they are, calling people names or making attacks, verbal attacks in a meeting, any member can raise their hand and say, I call a member to order. You do not have to sit there and endure bad behavior by someone. There's a series of degrees of things you can do. Calling to order is probably the lightest one. You can also move to censure the person if their behavior is particularly egregious, and that is just a recognition by the body that this person has done things that are inappropriate. You can also expel people from a meeting if by a vote if they're behaving poorly. But anyone can move to call someone to order if they are behaving poorly, and of course the motion is directed at the chair, and then the chair would say, would the member please refrain from calling names or whatever they're doing. So it's like the first step on the disciplinary list.
And Larry, all of those things, if you were to move to higher levels, censure or expulsion from the meeting, those are 2/3 votes based on?
Yes.
Or those majorities? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Ejecting someone from a meeting is taking away their right to attend the balance of the meeting. But that is different than if you have a situation where there are non-members in the meeting. So if you have non-members in the meeting and they are being unruly, the chair has the right to expel them from the meeting at any point in time. The chair is the keeper of the order of the meeting, and so the chair really has to step up and make sure that people are not abusing their the privilege of being at that meeting.
We have another question, Larry. Is a quorum included in Robert's rules?
Yes, a quorum is a majority, and that's your default. As you can imagine, if you have a membership of 2,000 members, it's probably unlikely that you're going to have 1,001 members show up for your meeting. It would be awesome if they did, but that's probably not going to happen. So what Robert's Rules recommends is that you set the quorum in the bylaws to the number of people that you can reasonably expect attend a meeting under normal circumstances. And they also recommend that you set this as a fixed number as opposed to a percentage, because if you do a percentage, then the number varies depending on how many members you have, and so you have to have an accurate membership roll, and it changes from meeting to meeting. It's much easier for people to remember that you need 20 people or whatever it is to conduct the meeting.
Great. Next question, Larry, is can a group have executive meetings not open to public and no minutes available to public?
Only if they're in executive session. Otherwise, they are not closed and the meetings are not kept secret in the absence of rules that modify this. So, you know, you always have this condition where there might be rules that have been passed by the organization that allow things to happen that deviate from your core rules of order. And so if your bylaws state that executive committee meetings are closed and no one can attend and that their minutes are secret, then that's what they can do. Again, this is giving away powers, which you should only do if really, really necessary. If it's an executive session, then that's a little bit different. That's because you're discussing something that's sensitive in nature, and you don't publish minutes of those kinds of things. And they're not open to anyone except the people that should be at the meeting.
So I think there was also some interest in Larry's rules for Zoom meetings. We'll reach out and get that document if you're comfortable sharing. We did have somebody ask for those.
Sure.
So I would tell you, at this point, any other questions? Oh, okay, hang on. So the question is, this is actually, I don't know if you'll be able to handle this. The question is, New Jersey Open Meetings Act questions, but if no business can be conducted over email, is it possible to have substantive discussions without motions? So I think this is a question I'm going to help a little bit here to say, the question is, I guess, you're not supposed to have a lot of discussion prior over email. Can you discuss things substantially in a meeting without a motion? And I guess if you could talk a little bit about whether you should be having email discussions prior to the meeting would be good too.
And this was with regard to open meeting laws?
So it comes, I think, out of Open Meetings Act questions, but I know that that's not exactly this, but I think probably most of us have experienced a time when there was substantial discussion about an agenda item. Agendas are typically released prior to a meeting, and there's a lot of discussion over email. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, so we still live in America where free speech is allowed at present. So if this is really about the open meeting laws, then it depends on what your state's laws about open meetings really say. So in my state, it says that no more than a majority of the members of a commission cannot meet outside of a formal meeting and discuss business. And they're so paranoid here that they don't even like for a majority to show up at a cocktail party. There's nothing wrong with communicating over email if it's allowed, you know, and this is governing the members only. So if you have like a county commission with 5 members, then the open meeting laws refer to them and their behavior. If you are a member of the public, you of course can communicate with your commissioners and tell them whatever you want by email or call them on the phone or, you know, in the grocery store. It all goes back to what your open meeting rules state in terms of law and what can be done. You know, if in the absence of those kinds of controls, then, you know, people can do whatever they want in advance, whether it's, you know, for good or for evil. One thing about democratically called meetings is that all these rules really apply to the meetings themselves. So from the point where you are gathering to the point when it adjourns, that's when people's behavior is really governed. And so things that occur outside of those limits, if they're illegal, then they can happen. If people are doing things that are illegal outside of those meetings, there's a whole process for dealing with that under disciplinary actions. The other thing I would like to say about committees is that Robert's Rules makes a set of abbreviated rules for the conduct of small boards and committees. And small boards and committees can have discussion outside of a motion. And also the chairs of small boards and committees can have a little more freedom to engage in debate and make motions. So they can act a little bit more like a member in those circumstances. A small board is considered 12 or less. So once you get into larger boards, then the chair should really revert to the full formal Robert's Rules of Order for administering the meeting. Committees, any committee can be run under the abbreviated rules.
Great. Got two questions that came in. We'll see if we can get to both of them here. If the presiding officer is the board president, does that mean the board president loses their right to vote?
They don't lose their right to vote. They have, as I said earlier, they don't vote when a vote is taken, because that conflicts with the rule about them being impartial. However, if it's a tie, then the chair can cast a deciding vote. So, because something takes a majority to pass, if something has been voted on and it's 19-19, then the chair would say, the votes in favor is 19, the votes against is 19, and so the chair votes in favor of the motion and the motion passes. So that's an instance where something would fail, then would pass because the chair cast a vote, or the chair can do the opposite, where the vote is 19 in favor, 18 against, the chair votes against it, and so the vote is 19-19 and the motion fails. So the chair only votes in the cases of a tie, or in the case of a secret ballot, because you can vote on the secret ballot and no one knows allegedly how you voted.
All right, I think this will be our last question. I think it goes back to something you talked about earlier, and sort of something we were talking about email outside of the meetings. We have a question just wanting further clarification. You talked about this a little bit, but if you could just go over this a little bit. What about side emails / texts during the meeting, as mentioned on the previous slide? I think in terms of folks communicating during the meeting.
Yeah, that's a problem it's a problem in electronic meetings, and that you do have alternate forms. And I've certainly been in meetings where we use the chat apps to have a discussion, because we have a contingent that wants to work together, and I've actually been in physical meetings where we've all been together, and people are on these chat apps being able to communicate. As long as it doesn't disturb the meeting, then you can do that. It's when the discussion starts becoming disruptive to the meeting itself that's a problem. So again, people can talk amongst themselves. There's no rule against people talking to each other and saying, if someone needs guidance on a motion or something like that, you can text them, that sort of thing. There's no rules against that unless your organization has passed special rules that prevent that sort of thing. And again, the chat window is really difficult to administer. People sometimes use the chat for people making motions, and they think that that's an adequate way for to control motions, control speech. And if they do this in an unbiased way, it's okay if there's an agreement in the rules that you can do this sort of thing. But I really discourage groups from relying on the chat for anything other than possibly getting the text of a motion. So if you have a complex motion that you're making, you can say, I move that the organization buy a truck for $20,000 and that it'd be, an American-made truck and, blah, blah, blah. If it's a long motion, then it's a convenience to the chair and to the secretary that you put the text of the motion inside the chat window, and then that's a great way of making sure that your intent is being carried through because you've given them the language that you want to move. But again, you shouldn't be carrying on a discussion in the chat window of a meeting. And so I recommend that organizations not even enable chat during a democratically run meeting. There is no requirement that you enable that unless there's a rule. And it tends to be disruptive to use that. And people really should be focusing on what is being said in the meeting because that's what's being recorded in the meeting minutes and what's being voted on by the body.
All right.
I hope I didn't beat that horse to death.
Larry, we
Yeah.
had one other question that was submitted during the registration. Can the standing committee chairperson make a motion to accept their own standing committee report? For example, a treasurer moving the treasurer's report.
Oh, yes. And so a committee chair is representing a committee, and so that's how committees bring their work. In organizations, most of the work is done inside committees, and they bring it to the body for approval or rejection. So, the Special Events Committee believes that it's important to have social meetings, and we think that they should happen twice a year. And so the committee moves that that we have 2 social events every year. And that doesn't require a second because it comes from a committee. If the committee is comprised of more than one person, and then it immediately goes to debate. Reports, yeah, the chair can move. I move that the report be adopted, and then it's up to the body to vote on it. Things like treasurer's reports are actually not voted on because the treasurer's report is considered a statement of fact. And so there's really nothing to reject because it's either accurate or it's inaccurate. And if it's inaccurate, then it has to be corrected to be accurate.
All right, Larry, I'll try to get one more in here. So I'm gonna suss this just a little bit. The question is, how about the liaison person does the majority of the meeting and making most of the decisions? I think this comes up for libraries sometimes. You can send a liaison from somebody who is sitting on the committee, normally on the board. And if you could talk a little bit about, the idea of member and whether or not a member can sort of get their power to another person for the purposes of the meeting.
If Robert's Rules of Order is your parliamentary authority, then that has to be a power that is explicitly granted to have proxies. Robert's Rules discourages the proxies happening, but if you do have proxies, then the rules on how proxies would perform inside a meeting should be codified in your bylaws.